Well, hello, boys and girls. Troy W. Hudson, and it is time for... Oh, I'm sorry. Did I leave you out? I'm sorry. Troy W. Hudson and Kazoo, and it's time for Story Time with Troy. All right, and Kazoo. Anyway, we've got a very special story this week, a classic American tale called... Tale, get it? The Tale of Peter Rabbit. This story is rich in history. It goes way, way back. It's copyright and was written by Beatrix Potter. And it was written actually before the turn, I believe, of the 20th century into the 19th century and in the late 1890s. Anyway, that was a long time ago. And I want to read you a little section of the story. Let's bring it up here where we can see it. I want to read you a little section of the story here where it talks about the origination of the story. Beatrix Potter first wrote the story of Peter Rabbit in a letter to a little boy named Noel Moore. She illustrated each incident with beautifully detailed sketches. A few years later, in the year 1902, Peter Rabbit was published in book form. And since then, the story has delighted countless children, and hopefully today, you. For in it, Beatrix Potter created a miniature world which children could readily enter. The publishers are proud to present this little golden book, freshly illustrated by the Italian artist Adriana Mazza Saviozzi. So, without further ado, this is The Tale of Peter Rabbit. Once upon a time, there were 4 little rabbits, and their names were Flopsy, Mopsy, Cottontail, and Peter. They lived with their mother in a sandbank underneath the root of a very big fir tree. "Now, my dears," said old Mrs. Rabbit one morning, "you may go into the fields or down the lane, but don't go into Mr. McGregor's garden." Can't you see Mama Rabbit saying, "Don't go into Mr. McGregor's garden"? "Your father had an accident there. He was put in a pie by Mrs. McGregor." "Oh, now run along and don't get into mischief. I'm going out." Poor Mr. Rabbit. Then old Mrs. Rabbit took a basket and her umbrella and went through the wood to the baker's. She bought a loaf of brown bread and 5 currant buns. There's Peter. Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail, who were good little bunnies, went down the lane to gather blackberries. But Peter, who was very naughty, ran straight away to Mr. McGregor's garden, and he squeezed under the gate. First, he ate some lettuces, and then some French beans, and then he ate some radishes. Well, at least he's eating healthy. And then, feeling rather sick, too much of a good thing is too much of a good thing, he went to look for some parsley. But round the end of a cucumber frame, whom should he meet but Mr. McGregor? Mr. McGregor was on his hands and knees planting out young cabbages, but he jumped up and ran after Peter, waving a rake and calling out, "Stop, thief!" Peter was most dreadfully frightened, wouldn't you be? He rushed all over the garden, for he had forgotten the way back to the gate. He lost one of his shoes among the cabbages, because rabbits wear shoes. and the other shoe amongst the potatoes, or potatoes. After losing them, he ran on 4 legs and went faster. Well, that was smart, Peter, so that he might have gotten away altogether if he had not unfortunately run into a gooseberry net and got caught by the large buttons on his jacket. It was a blue jacket with brass buttons and was quite new. Peter gave himself up for lost and shed big tears, but his sobs were overheard by some friendly sparrows who flew to him in great excitement, and they implored him to exert himself. Exert yourself, exert yourself. But Mr. McGregor came up with a sieve, which he intended to pop upon the top of Peter. But Peter wriggled out just in time, leaving his jacket behind, and he rushed into the tool shed and jumped into a can. It would have been a beautiful thing to hide in if it had not had so much water in it. Mr. McGregor was quite sure that Peter was somewhere in the tool shed. Where is that wascally wabbit? Perhaps hidden underneath a flower pot. He began to turn them over carefully, looking under each one. Presently, Peter sneezed. Mr. McGregor was after him in no time and tried to put his foot upon Peter, who jumped out of a window, upsetting 3 plants. The window was too small for Mr. McGregor, and he was tired of running after that wascally wabbit Peter. He went back to his work, and Peter got away. Peter sat down to rest. He was out of breath, and he was trembling with fright, and he had not the least idea which way to go. Also, he was very wet, damp, with sitting in that can of water. After a time, he began to wander about, going lippity-lippity, not very fast and looking all around, because that's what a rabbit does. They go lippity-lippity when they're not hopping very fast. He found a door in a wall, but it was locked, and there was no room for a fat little rabbit. Remember all that stuff he ate? He couldn't squeeze underneath. An old mouse was running in and out over the stone doorstep, carrying peas and beans to her family in the woods. Peter asked her the way to the gates, but she had such a large pea in her mouth that she couldn't answer. She only shook her head at him, and Peter began to cry. Then he tried to find his way straight across the garden, but he became more and more puzzled. Confused, presently he came to a pond where Mr. McGregor filled his water cans. A big white cat was staring at some goldfish. She sat very, very still, but now and then the tip of her tail twitched and twitched as if it were alive. Peter thought it best to go away without speaking to her. He had heard about cats from his cousin, little Benjamin Bunny. Kitty cats and bunny rabbits don't always get along. He went back towards the tool shed, but suddenly, quite close to him, he heard the noise of a hoe. Scritch, scratch, scratch, scritch. Peter scuttered underneath the bushes and hid. But presently, as nothing happened, he came out, and he climbed upon a wheelbarrow and he peeped over. The first thing he saw was Mr. McGregor hoeing onions. His back was turned towards Peter, and beyond him was the gate to freedom. Peter got down very quietly off the wheelbarrow and started running as fast as he could go along a straight walk behind some black currant bushes. Mr. McGregor caught sight of him at the corner, but Peter did not care. He slipped underneath the gate and was safe at last in the woods outside the garden. Mr. McGregor hung up the little jacket and the shoes for a scarecrow to frighten the blackbirds, and to remind Peter, if he should ever come back again, to beware. Peter never stopped running or looked behind him till he got home to the big fir tree. I can imagine. He was so tired that he flopped down upon the nice soft sand on the floor of the rabbit hole, and he shut his eyes. His mother was busy cooking, and she wondered what he had done with his clothes. It was the second little jacket and pair of shoes that Peter had lost in a fortnight. That's 2 weeks or 14 days. I'm so sorry to say that Peter was not very well during the evening. His mother put him to bed and made some chamomile tea, and she gave a dose of it to Peter. 1 tablespoonful to be taken at bedtime. But Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail had bread and milk and blackberries for supper because they were good little wabbits. But Peter, oh, Peter, Peter, Peter. That's the tale of Peter Rabbit. I hope you enjoyed it on this edition of Storytime with Troy. You, kiddos, have a wonderful weekend. Be blessed and be a blessing to someone else. Bye-bye.